We will begin today's event with a provisional land acknowledgement. We collectively acknowledge that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and for those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold Michigan State University more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. If this is your first time at a University Interdisciplinary Colloquium, welcome. We're really happy to have you here today. The University Interdisciplinary Colloquium, or UIC as we call it, is a forum that is organized by the Center for Interdisciplinarity at Michigan State University and sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters. It highlights the innovative and important interdisciplinary work involving the arts and humanities at Michigan State. Interdisciplinarity as a kind of organizing principle for scholarship and education at major research universities is often code for well-funded complex science, but some of the best and most influential interdisciplinary work from our perspective reflects an appreciation for aesthetic and humanistic dimensions of human experience broadly construed. And the UIC really is an attempt, it's a vehicle for acknowledging and amplifying interdisciplinary contributions that feature aesthetic and humanistic elements. We meet every other week on Fridays during the fall and spring semesters from 12 to 1 Eastern time. All of our sessions this year will be on Zoom, and so readily available for folks to check in if you're interested. The next UIC will be in 2 weeks on the 13th of November. Also again, 12 to 1 Eastern time on Zoom. The presenter will be Dr. Dylan Miner, Director of American Indian and Indigenous Studies and Professor in the Residential College of Arts and Humanities here at Michigan State. And Dylan will give a presentation entitled Art as Research, Research for Art. Today, we are very, very happy, very thrilled to have Dr. Kristin Arola, who grew up in the Kiwana Peninsula. You can tell I'm not from Michigan, sorry. How do you say that? Kiwana?
Kiwana.
Okay. My apologies.
All good.
In Michigan's UP, and is a proud Yooper of Finnish and Ojibwe ancestry. She earned her MS and PhD in Rhetoric and Technical Communication from Michigan Technological University. Before coming to Michigan State, she worked for 11 years at Washington State University, where she directed the Digital Technology and Culture undergraduate program and served as Director of Graduate Studies for the Department of English. She's currently an Associate Professor in Writing, Rhetoric, and American Cultures with affiliate appointments in American Indian and Indigenous Studies and Digital Humanities. Dr. Arola's research and teaching focus on the intersections between American Indian rhetoric, multimodal pedagogy, and digital rhetoric. She believes best practices for research, teaching, and teamwork must acknowledge and honor all relations that afford and affirm our making. As such, her work is rooted in Anishinaabe community practices, histories, and futures. In addition to being very well published, she is also currently a co-PI on an NSF, a National Science Foundation funded grant, Socio-Technological System Transitions, Michigan Community and Anishinaabe Renewable Energy Sovereignty, the aim of which is to increase the capacity of communities across Michigan, including tribal nation communities, to make decisions about energy systems in ways that support their values and well-being. Today, Dr. Arola is with us to deliver a talk entitled Strengthening Interdisciplinary Collaborations Through Indigenous and Humanist Voices. Dr. Arola.
All right, making sure you can hear me. We good? You hear me okay? Okay. Buju, Ani, greetings, Zoom land. Gawin, Hapachini Nata Anishinaabe Mosi. Kristin Arola, Indigenous, Makwan and Dodum, Wikwedong, Dollar Bay, Kiwanabe, Nindunjaba, Nikwejong Ninda, Sumalainen, Minawa Anishinaabeque Nindao. Hi, I'm Kristin, and I'm here today to ostensibly talk about the value of humanist and Indigenous voices on interdisciplinary teams. And I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do that by thinking through how we collectively imagine futures while acknowledging pasts. That is, how we might rethink our relationships to each other, to our universities, to our ways of making and knowing, and how we might do that honestly. I hope to think through today how we can move forward under conditions not of our own making, but still work to make something beautiful. So to do that, I'm first going to give an extended version of the land acknowledgement that you just heard, that we in American Indian and Indigenous Studies program crafted. Props to Christy Poitra, Beth Ponce, Dylan Miner, I think who did the bulk of that work. After that, I'm going to talk specifically about the NSF project, which was mentioned at the beginning. That particular project, according to NSF, it's part of their convergence research. And so convergence research, according to them, is a means of solving vexing research problems, in particular complex problems focusing on societal needs. And it includes integrating knowledge, methods, and expertise from different disciplines, forming novel frameworks to catalyze scientific discovery and innovation. So I'm going to get to that, but what I'm going to do at the front end is hopefully lead you through some illustrative reasons why it matters to have a humanist on your team. It's just not going to move forward unless I click the arrow. Okay, here we go. So one of my most vexing problems is how to function in a white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal, settler colonial structure while working to build something new. And while I don't know where you are located today, I do want to acknowledge, as has been done, that Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. And you're probably used to hearing these land acknowledgements. You might even kind of zone out during them. But I'm calling you in today to listen to the extended version and to think about the relations and histories with which we are all entangled. The university resides on land that was ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. Between 1807 and 1842, in just 35 years, 6 treaties were signed between the Anishinaabe and the US government, ceding all land of what is now Michigan. 35 years, it was gone. It's still here. In these treaty years, hundreds of treaties, agreements, and seizures built up the US land base. Surveyors carved it up into tracts of real estate. Settlers, speculators, corporations, and states stepped in as buyers or grantees, grabbing pieces according to various federal laws, one of which is the Morrill Act, which I'm getting to. But first, I want to share how my own family history is tangled up in a treaty. I have to go further north than Lansing to tell you this story, but this story illuminates the ways our histories live with all of us, the ways our decisions, even when made in the most challenging of circumstances, often have unintended, sometimes good, sometimes bad, consequences, and how we often are faced with choosing to act within circumstances not of our own making. Indigenous rhetorical practice, one that Andrea Riley-Markovitz and Malia Powell describe as a 4-part layered web that situates the body in a particular place across historical time, rooted in cultural practices that arise from and are responsible to a land base, is seen in the ways I introduced myself to you earlier. I very specifically spoken Anishinaabe, which you might not have understood, where I'm from, who my people are, where I am now. And so that positioning was very intentional for very specific reasons. This set of relations, place, time, cultural practice, and land, necessarily requires beginning with my genealogy. As doing so, as Tierra Naputi describes it, quote, enacts a system of knowledge that is personal, relational, and deeply intellectual. Starting with my own genealogy also fulfills my need to speak of indigeneity in a way that rhetorical studies in my own discipline, but I would argue the university as a whole, has not yet made possible, in a system of knowledge that has overwhelmingly perpetuated erasure and effacement of Indigenous work. So while rooted much further back, this is a story I know how to tell as of the mid-19th century. It takes place primarily in the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, which is that thumb that you see sticking out there into Lake Superior. It was this land where my Finnish relatives immigrated to and where my Anishinaabe relatives gathered. A quick note on terminology for those who aren't familiar. Anishinaabe is the name used to refer to the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. These groups are culturally and linguistically similar, and they are also members of the Three Fires Confederacy, which is a longstanding alliance between the three tribes. So my family, my mom's family in particular, specifically, is Ojibwe, which is also sometimes called Ojibwa and sometimes also Chippewa. So when you hear those, you're hearing the same thing. And my tribal connection is the Anishinaabekwe Indian community. So my homeland, like much of Michigan, is marked by colonialism and greed and survival. While much of lower Michigan was taken in the early treaty years, it took a bit longer for the US to become interested in the far northernmost region of the state, as the land isn't particularly suited to farming and the winters are long and difficult, which you may know if you've lived there or been there in the winter. Yet 3 years after Michigan became the 26th state admitted to the Union in 1837, state geologist Douglas Houghton published a report detailing the rich copper deposits in the Keweenaw Peninsula, deposits previously mined for thousands of years by Indigenous peoples. This report was released in 1840, and in 1842, the Ojibwe of northern Wisconsin and the western UP were pressured into signing the Treaty of La Pointe, ceding millions of acres of their mineral and timber-rich lands in exchange for retaining their already existing hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on their lands, forgiveness of a supposed $75,000 in debt to trading companies, debt that was incurred by deals between the government and unscrupulous traders who knew they could get their money back upon land cessations, and supposed annuity payments for 25 years that included a total of $36,000 roughly worth of supplies and services. The ensuing years saw 2 more treaties brokered as part of the Treaty of La Pointe. One was in 1844, which ceded Isle Royal, which they thought had more copper than it actually did, and another in 1854, sometimes referred to as the Treaty with the Chippewa, which ceded the Arrowhead region of Minnesota in exchange for reservations in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, including a good portion of the Keweenaw Indian community. For this land, the Ojibwa received a blacksmith, $11,000 for goods and cattle, $3,000 for, quote, moral and educational purposes, and again, some more money to enable them to meet their present and just engagements, money they never saw because it was supposedly paying off debts they owed. They also were promised 300 guns, ammunition, clothing, and 500 beaver traps, which is going to be the name of my future feminist punk band someday. This in exchange for millions of acres of mineral-rich land that, as Article 6 of the 1842 Treaty of La Pointe states, the Indians residing on the mineral district shall be subject to removal therefrom at the pleasure of the resident of the United States. So these treaties, both the ones that claim my own ancestors' lands and the ones that built up Michigan State University, mark a radical departure for the Anishinaabe, one where a reciprocal understanding of nature is colonized by a view of nature as an ownable commodity. As Cleland describes in Rites of Conquest, the history of culture of Michigan's Native Americans, for the Anishinaabe, the allotment of land was nonsensical because the land itself was not a property or the source of resources. It was a source of resources instead that served the common good. Such understandings of land evolved out of connections with place. The geographically rooted Ojibwe knew the land well, They knew where the reefs and the banks were that could shelter the fish, which wind and water conditions brought fish from one reef to another. They knew where and when the berries ripened, when the sap would rise in the sugar bush. Such ties to place were practical, deeply emotional, and spiritual. They defined people's homes. This type of land-based literacy is a tenet of Indigenous relationality, one that, as Gabriela Rios puts it, quote, recognizes that humans and the environment are in a relationship that is co-constituted and recognizes the environment's capacity to produce relations, end quote. In this worldview, understandings of land exist within relational thinking, whereby all things are responsible and related to each other. This is a very different approach than treating nature as an extractive resource. This extractive resource approach is directly seen in the treaties themselves, whereby land was mapped by settlers according to mineral or timber resources and the supporting land-based structures of removal, such as waterways. I've seen a map, and of course I couldn't find it for this presentation, that maps the QAnon really very specifically, points to all the waterways that could get the copper in and out of the QAnon. That's what they were interested in. So my Finlander relatives, these are not my Finlander relatives. My Finlander relatives at this point were still in Finland. But my Ojibwe French Canadian grandpa Antoine Picard, and you see his grandson here in the middle, more about them in a second. Here we go again, Ojibwe French Canadian grandpa Antoine Picard. He was employed by the Hudson Bay Company, and his obituary reads delightfully, quote, he could carry a pack of 100 pounds on his back from one trading port to the other and arrived at his destination 3 days sooner than any other man who ever attempted the journey with a similar load. He was present at the 1842 signing of the Treaty of La Pointe. As part of the 1842 and 1854 treaties, he received $6.46 and an 80-acre allotment that my mom and her cousins still have today. Some of the cousins, some sold off chunks of it. It's a long story. They also retain their rights to hunt, fish, and gather. So far as I can tell from the stories and the documents I found, Antoine played both sides of his ancestry, the French and the Ojibwe, in order to receive money and land for the treaty. What he could not know upon agreeing to these terms of the treaty was that his son, Joseph, who you see sitting in the front here, would go on to marry my grandma, my Nokomis Bebamishikwe, who's also sitting in the front here, who was later baptized Mary Agnes at a boarding school. The story goes that Bebamishikwe escaped the Sandy Lake massacre / tragedy, which itself was a direct result of the signing of the 1842 treaty. On February 6, 1850, US President Zachary Taylor reneged on the 1842 treaty and signed an executive order canceling the land usage rights of the Lake Superior Ojibwe, ordering their removal from lands in Wisconsin and Michigan. The Ojibwe, citing the promises made in the treaty, refused to leave. Officials in the administration, along with Minnesota Territory officials, hatched a plan to put pressure on the Ojibwe by changing the site of the fall annuity payments and supply provision from the usual spot at La Pointe, Wisconsin, to an isolated trade hub in Sandy Lake, Minnesota. By bringing the Ojibwe to Sandy Lake in late fall with plans to delay the supplies and payments, the government hoped to wear down their resistance to relocation. The Ojibwe arrived in late October, found no supplies waiting. They waited 2 months for only a fraction of the promised supplies to arrive. And in that time, crowded in inadequate camps and unable to relocate due to winter conditions, 400 Ojibwe died of disease, starvation, and freezing. But Bebamishikwe survived and relocated to Anishinaabekwe. And while her name may have been written over, Bishop Baraga baptized her and turned my Nokomis Bebamishikwe into my Grandma Mary. I am still here. Your Native colleagues and students are still here, and we still have the stories. We remember. Ugh, hate when that happens. Whew. Okay. I tell this story, for it illustrates both how our entanglements with history and the choices we make are messy and entangled with all of our relations. And the treaties that gave land to the homes we now live in and the universities we now work at were signed with hopes for futures and the understanding of promises from the federal government, most of which were never met. Scott Lyons, who's Leech Lake Ojibwe, also professor at University of Michigan, uses the X mark, a term I will return to later, to discuss the rhetorical complexity of treaty signing by natives. The X mark, referring to the literal X many treaty signers marked onto treaties, is, as Lyons states, a contaminated and coerced sign of consent made under conditions that are not of one's own making. It signifies power and a lack of power, agency and a lack of agency. It is a decision one makes when something has already been decided for you, but it is still a decision, damned if you do and damned if you don't. And yet there is always the prospect of slippage, indeterminacy, unforeseen consequences, or unintended results. It is always possible, that is, that an X mark could result in something good. Why else, we ask, would someone bother to make it? So when we say in the land acknowledgement that the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw, a treaty I am not, so far as I know, ancestrally connected to in the ways I am like the Treaty of La Pointe, it's more than just words. It's histories, it's bodies, it's entire lifeways. According to a map within the university archive, Anishinaabekwe maintained an Indian encampment south of the Red Cedar River when classes were first held at the university in 1857, which was 38 years after the Treaty of Saginaw. Stories I've been told are that Nequejang, which roughly translates to where the rivers meet, was a place of trading. As one of the first land-grant colleges, Michigan State University is a beneficiary of land allotted through the passing of the Morrill Act in 1862. The university prides itself on calling itself the nation's pioneer land-grant college, a term many of us find highly problematic. The Morrill Act, looking at my time, sorry, okay. The Morrill Act, which enabled the land-grant system, was passed in the same year, 1862, as both the Homestead Act, which granted 160 acres to individual settlers who improved and farmed land in the West, and the largest, same year also, as the largest mass hanging in the history of the United States. The state sanctioned, Abraham Lincoln authorized it, murder of 38 Dakota who were fighting against a land grab and another set of delayed annuity payments, similar to Sandy Lake. Just for some context, Sandy Lake was in 1850, so this is 12 years later, so same time frame roughly. So these men who died made an X mark of their own, a choice that, opposed to signing and complying with documents, led to their immediate death. I sometimes like to remember that the Morrill Act was officially called an act donating public lands to the several states and territories which may provide colleges for the benefit of agriculture and the mechanic arts. Contemporaries called it the Agricultural College Act. Like all US land law, the Morrill Act depended on dispossession. Dubiously acquired, stolen Indigenous land was the engine driving the growing nation's land economy. And the colleges on those lands were to train workers who could keep the machine running. Us here today are keeping the machine running. In March 2020, High Country News published Land Grab Universities, kind of an expose, a longer piece, where you can learn more. And I'm sure there are folks here who know much more about land grant colleges and the Morrill Act than I do. This is actually fairly new to me. But what they did is they located more than 99% of all Morrill Act acres, identifying their original Indigenous inhabitants and caretakers, and they researched the principal raised from their sale in the late 18th and early 20th centuries. And they unpack how the Morrill Act turned Indigenous land into college endowments, seed money for higher education. It's a half of an infographic from that article. So the act redistributed nearly 11 million acres to colleges. Not a single dollar was paid for more than a quarter of the parcels that supplied the grants. Land confiscated through outright seizure or by treaties that were never ratified by the federal government. the grants of land raised endowment principle for 52 institutions across the US, including Michigan State University. MSU was not just built on Indigenous land, but with the profits from Indigenous land. There is an indelible relationship between the creation of land grant institutions, the simultaneous and ongoing expropriation of Indigenous lands, and the governmentally coordinated genocide against Indigenous peoples. By recognizing the ways that settler colonial institutions benefit from these interconnected histories, we work to hold the university accountable. Holding accountable means seeing our history and seeing the people and lifeways our histories have attempted to erase. In American Indian and Indigenous studies, we recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, which you can see on this not very well designed slide, sorry, but they're there. We also advocate for other Indigenous people and historic tribes in Michigan, including the Burt Lake Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, Grand River Bands of Ottawa Indians, Mackinac Band of Chippewa and Ottawa Indians, and the Swan Creek Black River Confederated Ojibwe tribes across Turtle Island and throughout the Fourth World. We acknowledge the real ways that the state of Michigan, Michigan State University, and residents of this land have benefited from the forced and systematic removal of Anishinaabe and other Indigenous peoples from Michigan, particularly during the Indian removal period of the 19th century, much of which I just described. We affirm and acknowledge the Burt Lake Band, who were literally burned from their houses in 1900. What's often called the Burt Lake Burnout was a forced relocation of the Burt Lake Band of Chippewa and Ottawa Indians in the northern lower Michigan. A sheriff and his deputies literally burned down the band's village at the behest of a local land developer who claimed to have purchased the village land parcels for back taxes. We also acknowledge the Métis community who were forced from their community on Drummond Island when the border was drawn between the US and Canada. Likewise, we recognize that parts of what are now Michigan include land that was the traditional homelands as well of the Miami, Meskwaki, Sioux, Kickapoo, Menominee, and other Indigenous nations. We collectively understand that offering land acknowledgements or land recognitions do not absolve settler colonial privilege or diminish colonial structures of violence at either the individual or institutional level. We recognize that land acknowledgements must be preceded and followed with ongoing and unwavering commitments to American Indian and Indigenous communities. So I clearly jumped back into the extended land acknowledgement there, as opposed to the extended land acknowledgement, which I was giving you. There is one more paragraph of the extended land acknowledgement that I will share at the end of my talk today. But for now, I'm asking you to recognize, beyond a cerebral acknowledgement, that what those of us do at Michigan State, at any land grant institution, is literally built on and from the histories of stolen land and cultures. When AIS extended land acknowledgement says we work to hold the university accountable, this doesn't just mean someone else, some administrator out there. This means you, all of us. We can do better by the voices we include, the structures we interrogate, and the visibility we give. This isn't someone else's problem, but we first have to understand our own positionalities and the ways in which we are all complicit in a variety of ways. So with that, I've reached the end of the extended land acknowledgement, and I believe that everything I just told you has everything to do with how we responsibly and ethically build interdisciplinary teams and include Indigenous voices. It's by recognizing our past and working to build our futures. But perhaps a concrete example would help. So I move around a lot when I talk, so I stood up for this, but it's not even helping because I can't like move around the room without going off screen. So this is me marching in place before I move on to the next part. Okay, concrete example. When I was asked to give this talk, I had every intention of giving kind of a straightforward lessons learned hot take based on my work in this My Cares project, and not an extended land acknowledgement. But for me, the lessons learned are in many ways about working on teams and projects that work to acknowledge histories and work to build something better. It's also about recognizing the limits of our own ways of thinking and valuing that which we may not even know we don't know. It's about questioning our assumptions about how real knowledge is made, and about dismantling our own colonialist logics. So I am currently part of the MyCares team. MyCares stands for the Michigan Community and Anishinaabe Renewable Energy Sovereignty team. And it's funded by the National Science Foundation's Growing Convergence Research Program, GCR. This is a collaborative proposal project between Michigan Tech University, my alma mater, and Michigan State University. We were awarded $3.7 million to work on the following objectives. Understand the opportunities and barriers associated with renewable energy transitions for both electrical and thermal energy systems. Second, help rural communities and tribal nations in Michigan make decisions about electrical and thermal energy systems that align with their values and priorities. And third, develop a new convergent research field in socio-technological system transitions, STST, that can be applied to other STS systems and not just energy. I came to this project with zero grant experience and near zero experience working with people outside of my field. I have a PhD in rhetoric and technical communication, which might sound exactly like the kind of person who should be working on a socio-technological system change and decision-making project. But my research over the past 15 years post-PhD has been focused primarily on pedagogical concerns surrounding writing studies, multimodal composition, and Indigenous studies. My work focused, and still does in many ways, on interrogating best practices for teaching composing, be that composing through words, designs, images, beads, quill work, or any other form of meaning making. At the root of this interrogation for me is Anishinaabe community practices, histories, and futures, one that provides a path for best practices. For me, that's of teaching, that acknowledge and honor all relations that affirm and afford our making. Specifically in my work, I argue for work that values slowness and composing as culturing, which are both concepts I've learned through Indigenous making practices. So when I received an email in February 2019 from Professor Kathy Halverson, who's the University Professor Chair of Natural Resource Policy and Associate Vice President for Research Development at Michigan Tech, asking if I'd be interested in joining an NSF Convergence proposal team she was leading, I was honestly a little befuddled. Did she confuse me with someone else? Does she know what I do? So I did what any good Indigenous person would do. I hit the back channel. Kathy had mentioned working on a project with my friend Jerry Jondro from KBIC. So I, Humanity Indian Community, sorry. So I Facebook messaged him to see if he could tell me about her. I actually found it yesterday, which was fun. Jerry doesn't mince words, and so I thought he'd give me some truth. So the message, Kathy Halverson at MTU, good people, good heart, good intentions. His answer was that she's been working really hard on Indigenous issues and has met with me, he said, several other folks up here for a while. She's really making an attempt at understanding the issues and to be an ally. She received the Indian stamp of approval, and so I jumped on board. But I did let her know that I had hit the back channel in my response, telling her that, quote, I chatted with Jerry last night about some of the things y'all have been up to, and it sounds great. If I'm able to be of use, and if it's a project I feel good about, I'm more than happy to join the team. I share this moment as there's an awful lot coded in what seems like a few small moments of reaching out and responding, but for many Indigenous researchers, the intentionality behind this is everything. Coral Weber-Coax defines key principles she sees as foundational to Indigenous research, saying, the sources of a research project is the heart/mind of the researcher, and checking your heart is a critical element in the research process. The researcher ensures that there are no negative or selfish motives for doing the research, because that could bring suffering upon everyone in the community. A good heart guarantees a good motive, and good motives benefit everyone involved. The foundation of Indigenous research lies within the reality of the lived Indigenous experience. Indigenous researchers ground their research knowingly in the lives of real persons as individuals and social beings, not on the world of ideas. If you know Native folks, you know we are a suspicious people with good reason, as I hope my stories from earlier illustrate. So looking to see if someone has a good heart and is grounded in the lives of real people is a huge step towards agreeing to work with someone on a particular project, even if you don't even quite know what you're getting into. Like, you want to know that they're good people with a good heart, even if I wasn't sure if I could be useful. So I joined. We proposed and we received the grant in January, what now feels like a lifetime ago, and my last plane ride for who knows how long. The team attended the NSF Growing Convergence Research 2-day workshop in DC to onboard grant recipients. Our team was far and away the largest team present. It's a big team. I'm going to show you at the end the list of everyone on the team. The table had to be big, and yet the tables in the conference room literally were not big enough for all of us, and we weren't even all there. During one session, we were asked to all go around the table and think about what brought us to this particular project and what we hope to get from it. We all went around, we kind of scooched ourselves around one table at that point, not really fitting, sort of awkwardly out, and no one actually having a physical table spot in front of them. And we each briefly explained why we were there. I could not help but be struck by the difference in the ways the Indigenous and settler folks talked about their intentions. The settler origin members of the team mostly talked about what we normally consider markers for success in the university, things like wanting to change the field through research and scholarship. Meanwhile, the 4 Native folks that were there that day, and there's more on the team, each spoke about how they were there for the land, for the water, and for their communities. It reminded me of how Robin Kimmerer, professor of environmental and forest biology, frequently talks about how she doesn't want to be known in her community as a scientist, but wants to be known as someone working on behalf of the land and the people. These are fundamentally different, though not incompatible, worldviews. And that's where I think we need to find ways to build, figuring out then how to make a bigger table. I couldn't let that metaphor go. Sorry, it's going to keep happening. Figuring out then how to make a bigger table, one that can recognize these differences, but work within them to solve problems and forge new lines of flight, is one that we in My Cares are working towards. This work has to be both structural and individual. We need structures that allow and value this coming together, but we need individuals who see the value of worldviews outside their own. And so for now, I have a few messy key takeaways from our work. And I'm gonna grab a drink of water while you look at some pretty flowers. The first takeaway from it's just about a year now that I've been on this 5-year project. So the first is that even though the table might not fit us all, Kathy invited us anyways. The project includes universities, NGOs, tribal nations, and policymakers across Michigan. And these folks were involved from the get-go, not as an add-on after the university researchers realized they might need some help from the community. For example, the KBIC was also a partner in organizing the proposal itself. And the KBIC CEO, who's actually, interestingly, her grandpa is also Antoine Picard. We're like 5th cousins or something. She's also a co-PI. There are people like me who bring to the table Indigenous methodologies, experience in technical communication, extended land acknowledgements, which maybe you don't think have anything to do with renewable energy decision-making, but I'd say have everything to do with them. I find also the humanists on the team bring a lot of, wait, what? Which I think is really important. There are electrical engineers, foresters, community organizers, social scientists, energy policy specialists, Indigenous education experts, and we're all working together to build a bigger table. I'm not going to spend time on this in the interest of time, but if anyone wants it, I'm happy to send it to you. It's great. It's a vision for Indigenous evaluation that was shared with us. I think her last name is Wehepahana. And it talks, you can kind of see you move from working to someone for working as someone, kind of through both. It's okay. I wanted to talk more about this and I'm not going to. It's a nice slide. It's basically the point that you really need to have not be working for communities, but working as communities. Okay, my second takeaway is to build frameworks that encourage listening for what histories have been written over or ignored and working to build them back in. That is, along with making and or imagining a bigger table, we also need to make sure the table is comfortable, particularly for those who often aren't invited. Inviting them is not enough. Marie Schaefer, who's a postdoc on our team, reminds us of this often. Our conceptual framework from the get-go was built on Anishinaabe teachings of the medicine wheel or sacred hoop. This could have gone badly, but it was built by and with Native folks on the team with settler voices included. And so far, so good. This framework is significant, not only because it's foundational and interwoven throughout our approach, but because it acknowledges that MyCare's primary universities, MTU and MSU, occupy and were built with the profits from Anishinaabe land. So while we rely on Anishinaabe teachings to inform our framework, it's important to note that the Indigenous peoples employ varying versions of the medicine wheel as an interconnected system of teachings related to seasons, directions, elements, colors, and over the overall cyclical nature of life. So this is the framework that we built the proposal around and that we're actually doing our work around. The medicine wheel itself reflects the philosophy and practice of being in balance between and among time, space, and all beings. Illustrated in the framework are 4 equitable directions, with new beginnings originating in the east, sunrise and spring transitioning to the south, west, and then the north. As a whole and across space and time, the medicine wheel is inclusive of all interaction, all knowledge, and all virtues, while aiming to sustain balance through continuous transitions of all kinds. For the Ojibwe, the medicine wheel does not end, as Basil Johnston describes it, but instead transforms into a memory, organic material, nutrients, and energy, and the possibility of renewal. In other words, the medicine wheel both reifies a practice and philosophy of research with, by, and as Indigenous people, and simultaneously indicates new beginnings, a process of discovery, and continuous transformation of the research and the researchers. So on MyCares, we use the wheel, like I said, to kind of form both the way we're structured and the questions that we're asking. Just skipping a little bit here. The wheel and the questions thus not only guide our partnerships and our research with each other and tribal and non-tribal communities, but it provides balance based on the relational coming together of voices, communities, and ecosystems. The conceptual framework also allows for an approach across and between scales of decision-making, household, community, and regional. And then the 4 questions appear as a cycle on the medicine wheel. So we begin in the East. So what do we care about? What do we know? What is possible? And what can we do about it together? This framework highlights that the process of systems transitions is iterative, not linear, and does not end, but continues to adapt to changes in society and our environment. In short, by all working from a model that speaks to and from Indigenous values, we're held accountable to a process of relations between ourselves, the communities, and the work that essentially practices what we preach. And also in recognizing that these questions are iterative, we can't leave behind things like our histories and all the things I spoke about earlier in the talk. It's still with us. It's still in where we're building to. My final takeaway from what we've done so far is to make sure people move around the table to get a chance to share, listen, and work with each other. I don't know about you, but when I walk into a room with big tables to sit at, I try to find the people I know and I sit with them, and then I keep sitting with them because I'm too nervous to go talk to other people. So within the structure of the medicine wheel, we constructed ourselves into sub-teams who both work more focused on certain areas while making sure to acknowledge the relational nature between all of us. I, for example, am a sub-team 1 leader, which is the community engagement, kind of focused on the East a little bit, along with Chelsea Shelley, who's a social scientist at Michigan Tech. And we're all working to apply and build expertise and experience within our teams. We regularly meet and share knowledge across teams. So we'll have these kind of regular presentations from different people on the teams that it's like a sharing my expertise for non-experts. And a lot of these presentations have been really transformational. I know for one, I know more now about electrical grids than I ever thought I might. And then I also hope people on the team now know more about things like tribal sovereignty, treaty rights, and Indigenous research methodologies than perhaps they ever imagined. This work also works to support convergence research, which is a goal of the grant itself, thus proving that having a structure from the first place that values this type of work, or at least purports to, is key. So the individuals need to do the work, right? But the structures need to also support it. And I think this convergence work that we're working to do really does that. We're working towards deep convergence. I can say more about that if you're interested. Back to the slide, because I think it's pretty. Together, this integrated and cyclical process of listening, sharing, and learning not only builds trust between and within communities and the MyCares team, but creates a mutual learning process. One, I would argue, that works to disrupt our own colonial baggage about what counts as knowledge and whose voices are invited to the table. Thinking back then to Lyon's X mark from earlier, there are conditions not of our own making that we find ourselves part of all the time. And the mark we choose to make in these moments is variable and comes with different responsibilities and relations to the work, to our communities, and to our land bases. What is key then is to hear these differences, to understand them historically, and to move forward listening carefully and thinking about how we might build a bigger table. So, returning to the extended land acknowledgement, it ends with this. In AIS, we push MSU to recruit, retain, and support American Indian and Indigenous students, faculty, and staff. Moreover, we affirm that Michigan State University must support Indigenous communities and nations in Michigan, as well as throughout Turtle Island and across the Fourth World. We recognize and support and advocate for the sovereignty of Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, for historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, for Indigenous individuals and communities who live here and now, and for those who are forcibly removed from their homelands. We affirm Indigenous sovereignty and hold Michigan State University accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. We are not separate from the institutions for which we work. When we say we are holding MSU accountable, this also means we need to hold ourselves accountable. Short of giving the land back, our X mark can be to recognize and own up to our own histories and to work to build better collective futures. So Miigwech, thank you. This last piece of art is from Dylan Miner. I forgot the caption on there, so thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much, Kristin. We are happy to take questions. We have about 11 more minutes. And if you have a question or comment, we'd love to pass that along to Kristin to continue the conversation. So please feel free to drop anything you have along those lines into the chat or into the Q&A. Lots of love for the presentation. It was wonderful. Thank you, Kristin. There was a request for the medicine wheel framework slide. And so from April Lindala, and want to make sure to get that message to you.
Thank you. I forgot to include this at the end. Sorry, this is just, I wanted to give a sense of all the people that are on the team. So it's a lot. We've got, I feel like I need captions on this because nothing that I said, especially in the second half here, would be remotely possible with the work of all of these amazing people. There's so many of them. So,
wow, that's a big team.
So there we go.
Let's see. We have. I'm going to go ahead and ask a question if that's okay. You mentioned, so you're talking about this convergence project that you have, that you're a part of, and you showed a slide kind of quickly about the levels of convergence and kind of talked a little bit about that in connection with your project. And I'm curious how you're you're operationalizing that, especially given the differences that you mentioned, right? So you talked about the differences between the settler teammates and the indigenous teammates, and how, maybe that those differences were reflected in different values people have um, concerning their participation in a project like this. Those seem like potential obstacles to convergence. And I'm curious how you're thinking about it individually, and how the team is thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. I remember from the first time we all physically got together in January being, I think that a lot of this speaks to Kathy, quite frankly, having just put together a really good team of humans, um, because there's such a willingness on the team to acknowledge when they don't understand something, and then also not to take that personally, which I think is key in a lot of this, right? Like to not feel stupid asking questions. As someone who's coming out of the humanities, I find myself often, I was very trained, I think probably because I went to an engineering school, to feel like my work wasn't real enough, like my methodologies weren't serious enough to be taken seriously. And I think what this team is really affording is the opportunity to kind of be like, here's what I bring to the table, but also to feel okay asking, like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about when you're talking about like a solar battery. I don't understand it. Like, you need to explain it to me in a different way. And so I think for some of us, it's like modeling that type of question and conversation, especially for their grad students on the team. That recognition that everyone is bringing something to the table, but that you can't all know everything. And I think this team really illustrates that. And we're still working through it, right? It's still a matter sometimes of being willing to be like, I don't get it, or, ooh, do we really want to just focus on publications? What are we doing for the community? But we have those conversations. And like, no, we actually need the publications to keep getting the money. And then we need, like, so how do you balance that? But actually being very honest about those conversations, I think is huge.
Thank you. Kathy, Kathy Halverson has a question. And her question is, you touched on this, but could you expand on the role of humanists in big research teams like this? What do you bring, and how do you make the table bigger?
Yeah, that was my, and I find I think I still hear shadows of my fear of not being taken seriously, because I find I often speak up on the team like, as the humanist, because I sometimes feel kind of on the outside, but I think a lot of that's self-imposed on the outside feeling. Um, I think what those of us who are trained in the humanities can really bring to the table is kind of a meta awareness of what's going on, and kind of some of these really big questions of like, that all sounds really amazing and really cool, but have you thought about how that impacts the people on the ground? Or have you thought about sort of like, and I don't want to say like scientists aren't thinking about ethics, because of course they are, but I think what I've found on the team so far is that it seems like the humanists often kind of have this bird's eye view of things, where they're seeing, they might not know all the little pieces, but they're seeing how the machine is sort of working, and having some of these critical cultural questions about how to make that work in ways that are more effective, and kind of imagine these futures in better ways.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kathy, for the question. Are there other questions that people we haven't, let's see.
Hi, Michael, there's a question in the Q&A. Yeah.
Yes, from Krista Teston. I wonder if you have recommendations for those of us who teach some form of writing with or on behalf of communities. Are there assignments, learning objectives, or anything you might recommend we consider incorporating that you think might not already be covered?
Hi, Krista. That's a good question off the top of my head. I think for me, there's something really, I want to basically be able to say, like, you have to do the work to get it. And I think we can do all the training. In fact, I had a meeting right before this with some of the folks from sub team 1, and we're thinking about how to kind of scaffold in some training for everyone on the team about how they're actually working with communities. But that's beyond just sort of a best, like, here, go read this or watch this, or I'm going to give you a presentation. Because I think at a certain point, like, we all know that, like, you know, in some ways, like, I know I shouldn't step into a community and work for, like, I know, like, you kind of know these things that you shouldn't do, but actually enacting that in practice, particularly when you're sitting across the table from someone in an interview or a conversation, and knowing how to do that work well, it is, I think, really important. And so we're still kind of working with that on the team, particularly Val Gagno from Michigan Tech is kind of leading this this group where we're trying to figure it out. But I really think it's kind of like you need that real world sitting down and doing it. You can read all the stuff in the world, and until you're in the thick of it, it's hard to know exactly how you're going to fly. So that doesn't quite answer your question, Krista, but that's my attempt.
Thank you, Kristin. Let's see. We have from Derek McHale, thinking about the last quote, that last quote about a future being within reach. How does this project approach a future that you feel does justice to your own community? And how might other projects approach a more just future for Indigenous peoples?
Hey, Derek. The hard questions from the humanists. Future, I'm reading it and feeling it, Derek. How does it do justice to my own community, and how might other projects approach a more just future for Indigenous peoples? I have to say, lately, I'm really hung up on, I think in a good way, which sort of explains the first part of this presentation, in knowing our histories. And that's something that I used to just say casually, like, we didn't know, you know, people say it all the time, you need to know your history to know where you're going. But I really think there's something about, like, really feeling and knowing the histories of the places we work and the entanglements of those spaces, and the histories of the Indigenous peoples on the land is so critical to moving forward into these futures more ethically. I mean, I haven't been here long enough to know what our gen ed requirements are like, but you know, my own experience in gen ed requirements were kind of variable. And so, you know, gosh, I hope students are getting that type of education, because I think without it, you can't really solve problems for communities without knowing that deep history of where we've been and where we might head. It just seems so profoundly important to me, particularly at this moment in time. I think we're really being called to pay attention to where we've been right now, and I think a lot of people just want to move forward and get back to the way we were. And it's like, no, you got to go back more to think about where we've been and how we got to here. We can't just go back to last year and make it okay. So I think a calling to look back, however that looking back happens in our classes and our curriculums, I think then leads to, hopefully, more just futures for Indigenous peoples, for all peoples.
Thank you, Kristin, and thank you, Derek, for the question. I think we are at the end of our session. So again, thank you very much, Kristin, for your wonderful presentation. And please, everyone, if you have time in a couple of weeks at noon, consider joining us again for the next UIC. And we hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Thanks so much for spending time with us.